All right, so we're going to go ahead and record this. If you could, go ahead and turn off your videos except for me and Barb so that we can kind of save some bandwidth on this webinar. But again, I want to welcome you all to our monthly discussion. This presentation is part of the National Extension Master Gardener Coordinator Committee. We do these monthly webinars usually the third Wednesday of every month for Extension Master Gardener Coordinators, and it's an opportunity to talk about trends and issues and talk with each other and get some ideas and perspectives that we can use in our local and state programs. I do know that on this particular webinar, we may have some folks that aren't necessarily Master Gardener Coordinators. I had a lot of people messaging me asking for the link that might be in FCS or FNET programs or some other part of Extension who were really interested in food safety and what we were going to talk about today. So of course you are all welcome to, and we're really glad that you're here and happy that you found out about the webinar. So we're going to go through a couple of programmatic announcements and then we'll get into the presentation with Barb. So today our agenda are some announcements and then we'll have our discussion. And of course, if you have questions, you can ask questions at the end of the webinar. Or type them into the chat box, and we'll do our best to share those with the group and pull them out of the chat box. And then we'll wrap up at the end. So a few quick announcements. We have the National Extension Master Gardener Coordinators Conference. This is going virtual this year, and it takes place very soon, coming up September 14th through the 17th. The great thing is that the registration fee is only $50. Here's the link to register, and I will send that out with the recording as well. At the conference, if you are an Extension Master Gardener Coordinator, there's lots of opportunities for learning about how to evaluate your program, how to explain impacts and communicate with others and stakeholders about the success of your programs and your volunteers. We'll also have opportunities to network and talk about retaining volunteers. So if you haven't registered yet, please do. We're all very excited. The other thing that I'm excited to find out in this particular conference is we're going to be highlighting coordinators who have received awards for their programs. And so we'll get to hear a little bit about the people who have received awards and the successes that they're able to pull off with their volunteer programs. And our next Master Gardener Coordinators webinar will be Wednesday, September 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern. This is just a one-week postponement, and the reason why we did that is so that it wouldn't conflict with the Coordinators Conference next week. So I'll send out some announcements about that, but it will be Wednesday, the fourth Wednesday of the month at 2 p.m. And Pam Bennett will speak to us about fundraising, credibility, reputation, and our mission statements in Extension Master Gardener Volunteer Program. So I think that'll be a good one to tune into as well, because you know, our credibility and reputation is extremely important, and I know Pam will bring up a lot of great ideas that we can implement in our local programs. All right, are there any other announcements that I may not have covered? If you have one, go ahead and post it in the chat box. Or you may unmute yourself and let us know. Okay, well, hearing none, we'll go ahead and move on to our first poll. And we always like to find out what state people are tuning in from. So if you could share with us and let us know what state you're from, that would be great. Okay, so as you can see, Barb, we have people from all over, from Indiana to Montana to Wisconsin, where you're at, Iowa, Virginia, California, Maryland, and many others. So we are very happy that all of you are here today, and thank you for joining us. So we have another icebreaker, and this one was from Barb, and Barb wants to know, what is your favorite vegetable? So we have a lot of different vegetables that people really like. Sweet corn season, broccoli, green beans, potatoes in any format. Eggplant, asparagus. All right, so we have a wide diversity of vegetable lovers on the presentation today, which is really great because Barb's going to talk to us about food safety. And the reason why we came up with this presentation is that we thought, you know, during COVID-19, this is a great time, since we're not meeting in person, to really think about the future of our volunteer programs. And if you are anything like the Master Gardener programs in Florida, food is a huge component of our programs. We do potlucks and tastings and harvesting at community gardens. In fact, I know one colleague who jokes that he asks potential volunteers what their best recipe is and what they can cook on their application to the volunteer program. So things are going to change for us, and we all know that. And so I thought, and the rest of the committee, the national committee, thought it would be a great opportunity for Barb to come and speak to us about food safety. So let me tell you a little bit about Barb. Barbara Ingham received her PhD in food science from Cornell University, and Barbara serves as the Extension Food Safety Specialist and Professor of Food Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Barb's research term at UW is, at the University of Wisconsin, is currently studying pathogen survival on fresh and fresh-cut produce and possible intervention treatments to enhance the safety of fresh produce. So we are really happy that Barb is here with us. I want to thank her colleague and my colleague, Mike Maddox, for also recommending that Barb speak to our group today. So Barb, if you're ready, you may go ahead and take it away.
That's great. Thanks, Nicole. And it's wonderful to be able to talk with you about this topic. I was talking with Nicole before we started, and we just got back from a quick lunchtime run to the garden to harvest tomatoes, which are in abundance here in the upper Midwest this time of year. And I saw in the poll, someone said sweet corn. Yes, I think this, you know, sweet corn and a glass of milk is probably my favorite dinner this time of year. So that's great. So our agenda for this part of the program, we're actually going to talk a little bit about COVID-19, I think, because all of us are answering questions about COVID-19. This time with the situation that we're dealing with. And then I want to talk a little bit more about just general garden practices, but those with an overview, or those with a flavor, I guess, of COVID-19. So some safe harvesting practices, because many of us are into harvest season, and if you're in the far south in the United States, you may be planning actually a fall garden. And then we'll talk about food safety and harvest events. So potlucks and those kind of things, we'll touch on some general information with there. So Nicole, I'll ask you to move to the next slide for me. Great. So before we talk, just kind of get the elephant in the room dealt with here, and that is COVID-19. So we do want to remember, and we've been talking about this, I know, since March, so I don't want to belabor the point, but the coronavirus, or what we were referring to as COVID-19, is just one of a family of coronaviruses. So that these viruses, this family of viruses, has been studied since the 1960s. There are more than 40 recognized members of the family, and there are two long-established coronaviruses that cause up to 30% of the common cold every year. So this is a type of viruses that there has been active research for just a long time. It's this particular variant in the virus that certainly has upended all of our lives this year. We will remember that there was a coronavirus that we referred to as SARS, an outbreak in 2002 that killed 800 people around the world, but primarily in the Asian Pacific countries. So again, we've seen this before, we're just seeing it kind of magnified right now. The COVID-19 coronavirus is referred to by the CDC and some of these other agencies as SARS-CoV-2. That's how they're referring to it. Next slide, please. Great. So we want to remind ourselves how the coronavirus or COVID-19 does spread. Again, it's a respiratory virus, and it spreads primarily through the respiratory system. And the main transmission route appears to be through person-to-person droplet infection. So someone coughs, sneezes, and then you inhale droplets, infected droplets from that individual. Where there is research evidence, at least, that contact transmission, so picking up the virus from a surface, may occur. There aren't any documented cases where this has happened. With contact transmission, the virus needs then to move from that surface and directly in contact with the membranes, the mucous membranes, either in our nose, in our mouth, or perhaps around our eyes. So the virus, you know, you'd have to take a hand that was contaminated and then place it directly either in your nose, around your eyes, or in your mouth. We don't believe that there's, and we know that there's no evidence that actually a contaminated hand going onto food could then transfer that virus particles and infect an individual. So overall, what we're certainly finding is that social distancing and hand washing are really key this year, and we'll see really some of these principles have been with us for a while. We're just needing to reinforce them at this time. Next slide, please. So in order to put things into perspective, I guess, so the coronavirus is a virus. It's a RNA material that is enclosed in an envelope. And what we noticed that if we look at actual US annual foodborne illness data, where we might recognize bacterial illnesses, and those are often in the news, there are a variety of things that can make individuals sick in the US that are actually foodborne, so not the coronavirus. Things like salmonella, which is a bacterium, cyclospora, which we're currently dealing with, which is a parasite. And then there are viruses. Most often these are noroviruses or Norwalk viruses. They're not this common cold type of infection. But foodborne illnesses are important. If you've been reading the news, I know that I was blogging this morning about an additional several hundred cases linked to salmonella outbreak that's happening nationally, linked to contaminated onions. You know, we'd hope that this foodborne illness would be preventable, and those individuals either wouldn't be getting sick and in some cases find themselves in the hospital. The same is true with the cyclospora outbreak that's currently going on linked to bagged lettuce. We'd really like to see these illnesses prevented. We'd like to see zeros in these numbers of cases columns. That's probably unrealistic. There are a lot of people in the United States and a lot of food coming from a lot of different places, but these are largely preventable. There are individuals within the categories of individuals who get sick are more at risk for significant illness. These are children, the elderly, pregnant women, and those with compromised immune systems. So for those individuals in particular, and they're often individuals that we may be working with in community gardens. Children, that's a great activity for gardening. There may be elderly individuals who are finding some social activity through gardening, what have you. So again, largely preventable, and we want to do everything we can to make sure that we don't add data points to this particular column. Okay, one more slide that's specifically focused on the coronavirus, Nicole, if you don't mind, and then we'll focus a little bit more on food safety per se. So information that we see from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, from the Food and Drug Administration, repeatedly are reinforcing that there's no evidence that COVID-19 is a foodborne illness. So again, salmonella can make you sick because it's a bacterium. It can actually grow perhaps in the food. It also can potentially grow in your gut. And that's when you come down with salmonellosis, it's because the organism is often growing in your gut and making you sick. And there's just no evidence that this happens with the coronavirus, that it actually can be transferred through food, that food is a vehicle at all. There also are no cases of fecal oral transmission. And this is where perhaps someone has used the restroom and they haven't properly washed their hands, then they've touched food, and then that's perhaps made an individual sick. This is the route that we're seeing for cyclospora that's currently linked to these bagged salads that have been distributed across almost all of the 50 states. That's a fecal oral transmission route. Again, preventable, perhaps, and so something that we want to just be aware of. I think we're really lucky that we're finding that the coronavirus is relatively fragile. And the reason that we're going to focus a little bit on hand washing as we go through today, and we've already talked that it's a basic measure that the Center for Disease Control is already highlighting, is because soap and water actually are huge heroes. So as we wash our hands properly, wetting our hands, washing with soap for 20 seconds, and then rinsing our hands, we know that the coronavirus, that envelope, that bumpy outer surface of the coronavirus is actually destroyed by hand soap. So you can destroy that virus and rinse it down the drain. It really works great. Disinfectants and cleaning sprays work a little bit differently, but they in large part do also appear to be effective against the coronavirus. So we have some tools in our toolkit. We just sometimes have to remember to use them. I see in the chat box, thanks. Mike has talked about, there is a food safety blog. It's food safety and food preservation blog, and the link to that is in the chat box. So today was onions, tomorrow is going to be an update on bagged salads, and then we'll get back to some food preservation topics in my blog, because that's really more fun to talk about anyway for that. Let's see, Nicole, if you don't mind the next slide. So I decided to focus on gardening on community gardens. So these are shared spaces. So whether or not you're serving as a volunteer actually in a community garden, this is the space where I garden is a community garden. I love the social aspect of it, and seeing what other people are growing and that type of thing. It's just a very rewarding activity for my husband and I. But I think this puts gardening into a context where it's not just you. And so anyway, I thought this would be useful for us because there's some specific challenges perhaps this time of year related to coronavirus and community gardens. And I'm thinking that as we move forward, potentially some of these practices will continue to exist. They're just best practices, and we'll see those with us perhaps for the foreseeable future, or perhaps forever. So this is my husband washing his hands at the garden where we garden, about maybe 5 miles or so from our home, and some very resourceful individual. We garden at some land that was donated by a church, and someone built this amazing hand wash station. There are two at either end of the garden, one at either end of the garden, and there's a foot operated water dispenser. There's soap there, and there's the little sign there that tells you how to wash your hands. And we recommend this year, whether individuals are harvesting for the food pantry garden, there's a large food pantry garden in this space, whether you're harvesting for yourself or you're harvesting for the food pantry garden, that you wash in and wash out of the garden. The wonderful thing about this is that it also prevents some spread of disease, because of course humans, as we move through activities, can spread disease to plants in some instances. So washing hands in and out of the garden is a great practice. This time of year, or this scenario that we're dealt this year, we're also asking members of our community garden to practice physical distancing among non-family members. We're asking people to stay home if they're ill. But you know, that would be a good practice regardless. Hand washing is good. If you have a garden that you're working with and they don't have a hand wash station like this, you might be able to rig something up with a water jug and a bar of soap and a pair of pantyhose. That used to be the go-to for Girl Scouts when I was a Girl Scout leader for many years. Alcohol hand sanitizers will also work, and some gardens in the area that I'm working with do supply those. Hand sanitizers don't work as well when your hands are dirty. So that's the only caveat, but they do work in a pinch. And then there has been talk about disinfecting common touch points within gardens. I've noticed that our garden, we don't tend to do that. We tend to wash our hands and then move to our own plots or move to the food pantry plot, and there isn't a lot of that extra precautions being taken. I think we're all hopefully focusing on what's most necessary and perhaps for whatever reason backing off of some other things. Next slide, please. There's a couple things I'm gonna, and there's the URL is here, the slides will be available after, so you don't have to copy these down. Mike Maddox, who's on today, he's my colleague at the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension, will recognize these. There's some amazing materials that our group here in Wisconsin, the Master Gardener Group, put together for best practices for community gardeners during COVID-19. I just urge you to look at these. They're available in multiple languages. They're nice graphics. So as people, perhaps you're working in a school garden and maybe kids are coming back to school or school's just starting in some parts of the country, these might be good graphics, good posters to copy and paste. Again, making gardening more available to everyone because we're sharing information in lots of different languages that makes it more accessible. Okay, let's see, next slide, please. All right, so what we want to do, let's see, one more back. There we go. We'll remember that the food safety basics are still the same. Hopefully you're aware of those. Probably about maybe almost 20 years ago now, the Partnership for Food Safety Education came up with some core messages: cook, clean, chill, and separate. So cook to proper temperatures; clean, wash hands and surfaces often; chill, refrigerate promptly; separate, prevent cross-contamination. And then I added for this one, stay informed. And that's because all of the produce items that are listed on or shown on this slide have been involved in large-scale national outbreaks recently. We saw packaged broccoli and cauliflower mix earlier in the summer, blackberries the same earlier in the summer. We're currently dealing with this outbreak linked to red onions, and that's expanded to different types of onions that may have come from the same growing region and or have been handled on the same equipment. And then the onions are Salmonella Newport, an outbreak linked to that. And then the again, outbreak linked to Cyclospora, which is a parasite. In bagged salad mixes, the parasite appears at this point from an FDA investigation to be probably linked to contaminated water. So irrigation canals, the lettuce is coming to us from Florida, not distributed in Florida, but primarily in the upper Midwest. And it's contaminated water that is causing the problems in that particular case. Let's see. Let me go ahead and we'll move on to the next slide. And I'm going to make a note of a question that I see here coming in, and we'll work on that. All right. So I tried to look at our basic food safety messages: cook, clean, chill, and separate. And then think about what could we as gardeners, or you as master gardener teachers, what could you do? What messages do we have for consumers that might be asking, especially with produce? And I should have potentially said that when we were looking at the outbreak data earlier, and we had bacteria, viruses, protozoa, parasitic protozoa, and national data linked to foodborne illness outbreaks. What categories of food do we see problematic? And it's produce. And that's largely because if we look at this little box under food safety for master gardeners on this slide, the safest fruits and vegetables are cooked. And this is cooking or heating as an intervention that we use for meat. You know, so why do we see fewer recalls linked to meat or pathogen contaminated meat is largely because the food industry has learned how to properly cook product, and it often doesn't get out into circulation if something's gone wrong, because there's some food safety steps. But we don't have that with fresh produce. We call those RACs, raw agricultural commodities, if we're working in the food industry. So the next safest are rinsed. So that's basically the intervention that we have is we sometimes refer to this as washing. I don't like that term. Rinsing is rinsing with water. And certainly from a CDC standpoint, where this information is coming from, and then we just kind of know in general how that works, we want to avoid unwashed fresh produce. So it's, you know, I'm in the garden today harvesting tomatoes, a lot of cherry tomatoes. And of course, what am I doing? I'm stuffing my face at the same time, because there's absolutely nothing better than a tomato fresh out of the garden. And I know that. I also know, I have an idea of, you know, how it's grown. It's grown within my little plot of ground. So I'm taking a little bit of a risk, but I'm comfortable with that. Things that come in from the grocery store that I might buy at retail or even a farmer's market, even that little bit of distance between me and the growing sometimes leads me to wonder. And rinsing produce is something that I do practice pretty religiously. So let's look at some overall steps, and then we'll come back to this rinsing produce a little bit later. So cooking will work. So perhaps let's see, a good example is the onions that are involved in this current national recall. So my daughter called, she had heard about the recall. She happens to be at school at the University of Georgia. She's a graduate student there. And she said, Mom, you know, can I eat these onions? I said, sure. You know, if you just remember that these onions were purchased during the time of the recall, which is going from May 1st till August 1st. So that's a lot of onions. And she purchased during that time. So, you know, if you segregate those for cooking and then don't contaminate after that, I think you'd be okay. She chose to compost them because she didn't want to have to remember that. She's having to remember other things. But cooking will often work, but we just often don't cook produce like lettuce. I'm sorry, who's gonna lettuce soup? I don't know. I guess I've never had it, and I'm not at first in line to try. So rinsing or cleaning, washing hands certainly prior to touching produce items of any kind, and rinsing most produce. Then chill. So anytime we have produce, once it's been cut, we want to refrigerate that. We want to refrigerate hot leftovers promptly if they contain produce and or any other type of items. So put those in the refrigerator within 2 hours, even if they've, you know, if they come out of the oven. And then separate cutting boards for fresh and cooked produce items, for produce items, raw meats, what have you. Those are just good basic practices that we have that we're aware of. In store, so I said, you know, stay informed is a good extra step. I sometimes add store. So another safety step is storing food in the right location for the right amount of time. I said the Goldilocks approach. This is where we look at the dates that are on food products. Probably we think about these more often with things like cereal or pasta, things like that you might have in your kitchen. So food dates are quality dates, but they are a guide to how long we should store things. So it's a good idea to go through your cupboards, go through your refrigerators, go through your freezers, and don't store things too long because quality will deteriorate. And then I also remind us all to choose wisely. There are some foods that food microbiologists, such as myself, simply do not consume. They just happen to be riskier. It's not to say that a healthy adult can't make the choice to consume these items. Happens to be that I don't. So some of these risky foods are raw oysters. raw meat or undercooked meat. My father grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and I do remember him talking about eating what are referred to as cannibal sandwiches. We used to do this at Christmas time. So this is raw meat, often ground and then chopped with onions, and then on small pieces of rye bread. It's not something that I would do, and my dad stopped doing it once he met my mom, and she wouldn't let him do it anymore. Another item that is many microbiologists won't eat are raw sprouted seeds. So these would be like the alfalfa sprouts and those kind of things. Even if you sprout them at home, it's more often the seeds are contaminated in the growing process. Raw milk or unpasteurized milk. Those of us in the dairy state have ready access to pasteurized milk, and I potentially or do not drink unpasteurized milk. And then unwashed produce or unrinsed produce is another thing I'll say. You know, that's another, it's a little riskier when you choose not to rinse your produce items, and certainly those that are coming from retail. So let's delve into this particular one food safety step just a little bit, and we'll go to the next slide, please. All right, I said wash hands, rinse produce. And I know as educators, I fall into this trap as easily as the next person, and that is I use washing for produce. And I tried not to do that because I don't want consumers to think we use soap, because we do not. We use just water, clean water for produce. For with our hands, we wet our hands with clean water, apply soap and lather for 20 seconds, rinse with clean water. That's important, right? We actually want to rinse everything that we've pulled off of our hands down the drain with that rinse step, and then dry with a clean towel. Unless you're using an antibacterial soap, and this is more often a pump soap, but just plain bar soap. If you're using plain bar soap, the soap isn't killing the organ, it's not killing anything. It is destroying the coronavirus, so that makes it cool. But if you're looking at salmonella or pathogenic E. coli, the soap isn't destroying those. It's actually, soap is what's referred to as a surfactant. One part of it hangs onto the water, the other part of it hangs on to the soap and the lipid, and together the oils on your skin, the dirt and those kind of things, it kind of wraps its arms around the bacteria and picks them up off your skin. That's what soap is helping to do, and then allows you to rinse those things like salmonella down the drain when we use that on our hands. So in addition to this, we disinfect or sanitize an already clean surface. So if you have countertops in your kitchen, and we'll say, oh, you know, you want to rinse your produce, you want to rinse your cutting boards, you want to clean your cutting boards actually after you've chopped produce on those cutting boards. And then some people prefer to sanitize or disinfect. So just a reminder that that happens after cleaning. We wash, we rinse, and then we disinfect or sanitize. This is designed to work most effectively on a surface that's already clean. So we've washed and we've rinsed. And I just put on this slide, there's a lot of spray type sanitizers or disinfectants that are on the market that you can use in your kitchen. Some of these are also recommended for disinfecting and COVID-19 time. A really practical, very inexpensive sanitizer is just bleach, bleach and water. So a teaspoon of bleach per 4 cups of water. So if you had like a spray pump or something like that, you could keep this in that container for, at least 2 weeks. And you could use it on the surface the same as you would any other disinfectant, and you let it air dry 30 seconds and it's done what it needs to do. So these disinfectants or sanitizers, they actually kill the bacteria that remain on the surface that's after the cleaning process. So they can be pretty helpful. They work against the coronavirus as well. So we do not recommend using bleach on fresh fruits and vegetables because it's not designed for us to consume products that have had bleach on it. And bleach is designed for hard surfaces, granite countertops, Formica countertops, tile flooring, you know, something like that. So bleach or other sanitizers are designed for those surfaces. They're not designed for the soft surfaces that we might find on fruits and vegetables. Okay, next slide, please. So what do we do with produce? Let's just spend just a minute or so here on that. So if we're gonna handle produce at home, whether it comes from our own garden or whether it comes from a retail environment like a grocery store or a farmer's market, you want to remember to wash your hands. So don't undo everything that you're trying to do simply by having hands that aren't clean when you touch fresh produce. So wash your hands for 20 seconds like we just talked about, and then we rinse fresh fruits and vegetables in clean water. So if you have a firm surface like an apple, plums, I had some delicious plums the other day, it's certainly a good idea to kind of use your hands and scrub those surfaces. Not necessary to use a brush or anything, but you can just with your hands just wash over the surface. I tend to do that with tomatoes as well. Then they can drip dry, or you can gently dry them with a clean towel, preferably a paper towel. That's all that you need. We do remind consumers who might be harvesting in the gardens where you're working that we want rinsing, but you don't rinse necessarily things when you bring them right out of the garden. Because as you all know, and you're great gardeners, that moisture, if you bring moisture into contact with fruits and vegetables, they're so perishable, they'll just decay. So we do rinse things just before eating or preparing. And so that will be perhaps, you know, for fresh berries, rinsing through a colander or something like that. But it's certainly fine for the learners that you may work with in a garden to bring their tomatoes in out of the garden, to bring their cucumbers in, to bring squashes or things like that, and to store them without rinsing. That's certainly fine to do. And then as they take things perhaps out of a particular storage environment, then we want to see them rinsed just before consuming. And we don't use soap or bleach or other chemicals for our fresh produce, just clean water. That's as good as it's going to get. And if you've seen the data, you will know that water is only going to do so much. So we're also very cognizant when we see recalls linked to lettuce or onions or anything else, that unfortunately once things do become contaminated in the field, there's not a lot we can do. Water is what's recommended, it's what we need. We want consumers to do this, but it has limited efficacy. And that's kind of what we're up against with produce, and why if we look at data linking foodborne illness outbreaks with types of commodities that those are linked to, we do find increasingly fresh produce is the #1 contributor to foodborne illness outbreaks and illnesses in a given year, and that is because we don't have anything other than rinsing with water. Once peeled or cut, all produce should be kept refrigerated. And I do remind us not to rinse bagged salads. So even though we're seeing some current recalls linked to bagged salads, the evidence indicates, and there have been studies on this, to look at consumer handling practices. There's plenty of evidence that says we're far more likely to contaminate that lettuce by rinsing it than to actually clean it up with a rinse. So if you have a bag salad and you know it's safe, then it doesn't have cyclospora in it, which of course you couldn't tell, but anyway, if you happen to know that it was, or if you have lettuce, you know, or something from your garden and happen to find its way into a bag salad mix, you wouldn't rinse those. You could just open them up and put them in the salad bowl. That's fine to do. All right, and our another slide here before we look at some other master gardener type things of interest this time of year. Let's go to the last one, and that is just a reminder, the next slide, I'm sorry. Yep. at least in Wisconsin, we seem to have water events, perhaps flood events, either in June or in August, or maybe both. So over the last several years, we have had major flooding. This year we had some significant storms early in the year in the northern part of our state, and people were wondering about, could they keep the produce items and continue to grow those items in their garden? So tomato plants where maybe the fruit had been set, but you know, they were so early in the growing season. And our recommendation was, yes, there was probably a lot of that could be salvaged. But this time of the year, at least in the upper Midwest, it's a lot harder to make that call. We generally need about 60 days of growing to have some data that will tell us that there's a good likelihood that simply environmental conditions, which is the sun and the heat, will potentially destroy pathogenic bacteria or viruses that may have been brought in by floodwaters. So right now, when we're in the flood season, or we do have a flood event, and we're at the harvest season, it's a little harder to make that call. I would say, you know, if this is an issue in your state, certainly refer to your extension specialists within your state for help in helping consumers navigate what can they keep and what should they destroy. It really depends on the type of crop often, and then where you are in the growing season, and whether something can be cooked. There's often some cooking will help you salvage a good many things, even late in the season. So we don't want salvaged produce from flooded fields. So the picture here at the top of the graphic, you know, that's too you know, you wouldn't pick those squashes and, you know, out of the ground and expect then that those would be okay for eating, or certainly even for selling at a farmer's markets. We do want you to wash your hands, or anybody to wash your hands before harvesting, early in the day for best quality. These are standard, you know, produce physiology standards that you all know better even than I do. Avoid damaged or rotten fruits and vegetables, and follow storage guidelines for maximum shelf life, which is for time as well as for temperature. And I just remind you, for anyone who might work with food pantries, again, the garden where I garden has an extensive food pantry garden growing for several local food pantries. We do have some educational material that we've been rolling out for a couple of years, Safe Produce for Food Pantries. It's a nationally funded project from USDA, where we put together some materials, and I worked with Ohio and Michigan to develop some teaching materials, both for gardeners that may be gardening in order to donate, and then also for food pantries, so that they're accepting produce in order to keep the guests of those food pantries safe. So that's just a link to that particular item. Okay, let me go to the next slide, which is a poll slide, another poll slide. I'm sorry, I've talked a lot, but let's just have you type in the chat box the food or produce tasting, whether you offer these food samples or produce tasting at Master Gardener volunteer events. Oh, some used to. Actually, right, we should think about not just, so this year could be different. What about normally, usually? Oh, lots of yeses. Okay, so thanks for responding to that. Let's see, Nicole, I think we'll go to the next slide. And that's interesting. If you look at your colleagues, we're moving until there's more no's than yes. You know, there are some best practices. So if you're going to do this, it can be a great way to introduce new fruits and vegetables to gardeners, or to those who aren't familiar with gardening, perhaps interesting people in getting into the gardening addiction, as my brother would say. But there are some things to remember when you do that. And again, especially in the time of COVID-19. So here we have best practices, follow public health recommendations, and this is just for this year, hopefully. Don't share food or offer food of any kind for tasting. That's for this year. We're just trying to prevent people from sharing food items There's just chances, not for the food to be a vehicle, but people to get too close to each other, and for things to to create unsafe situations. Practice social distancing, wearing cloth face coverings. And when you're tasting items, you can't use that cloth face covering, even if you're close to someone. So that's primarily why we discourage that this time of year. If you were to do it in subsequent years, remember to refrigerate produce once it's been cut. So don't leave it out there on the picnic table for people to enjoy all afternoon, whether it be watermelon or tomatoes, right? You've got a 2-hour window there. So temperature control, hot or cold in that particular case, refrigerate cut items. If you are having potlucks, which can be a great way to enhance the social aspect of gardening, just remember that there's food safety for groups. This is a standard training material that we have in food safety education. And so reach out to your extension group from your state and ask for specific training if you need help or some guidelines in terms of potluck safety. And then transporting food safely. This is whether or not it's being donated, like if you're taking something to raw produce to a food pantry, you want to make sure you keep it nice and perhaps cooler, or you don't want to keep it in a hot car and have it rot so your donation doesn't count anymore. Or if it's a potluck, make sure that you keep things hot or keep things cold, regardless of that. Okay, our next slide also talks about harvest events specifically in 2020. These are standard recommendations from the Center for Disease Control. And again, it's an indication of where we are this year. To limit multifamily events, discourage food sharing. Here's an idea though that the garden that I work with is trying to keep gardening in the way that we always have done. And so an idea that we've picked up is at-home tasting with recipes. So we have a pretty active email list, and we can ask people to prepare a recipe and maybe try it. Or we've also tried just having people share together through a Zoom meeting, you know, how do you use zucchini? What are some favorite things? And so we're trying to do some of those kind of things at home that are still bringing us together. And I would encourage you, whenever you get together as a group, either Master Gardener volunteers or with individuals that you may support, to reinforce produce safety messages, which are these primary two: washing hands and rinsing produce just before eating or preparing. All right, and then I've got one more slide, and then we've got some time for questions, which is good, and the wrap up that Nicole wanted us to have time for. That is food safety updates. So there's a blog, there's some information that comes out, like I said, almost daily this time of year, but there's produce safety tabs where there's a link to these, the information that the Master Gardeners shared, these wonderful posters that you might put at a garden specifically for this type of year. Then there's a link specifically to the Wisconsin horticulture site where those are pulled from, and or I'm linking to that. And then there's Safe Produce for Food Pantries, which has two different components: Make Your Donation Count, which is for our growers who might want to donate to food pantries, and Keep It Fresh and Healthy, which is for the food pantries to help them distribute fresh produce. With that, Nicole, I think we can go on to the next slide, which is just for questions. And I'm just indicating, it said that Lauren has shared an idea for perhaps a way to get together, having a share your ugly fruits and vegetable activity on Zoom. What a fabulous idea. I think you could almost hold, and I know in Wisconsin, because our county fairs have largely been canceled because of some of our governor's orders, you can almost hold some virtual county fair type activities through Zoom this year. So that would be good. Ugly but tasty, Lauren is saying. So that's a great idea. So thank you for that. I think if you have a question, you could probably put it in the chat, and we'll see how Nicole wants us to move through the last little bit of our time together.
Sure. So Barb, you gave us great ideas on how to move forward in this COVID-19 era. Also, now is a great time to evaluate what we're already doing in our volunteer programs and to think about food safety, even food safety at home. So I appreciate the refresher on the best practices that we can all implement for our own families. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type your question in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask Barb or me. Or if you've had programs that you want to share, something that you're doing in your county or your state that's working, let us know as well. I do know some people have come up with resources for signage for community gardens. If anyone has any resources to share or would like to give permission to share that, then you may email me and let me know, and I'll send that out with the recording. Lauren, I really like your suggestion about the ugly fruits and veggies activity on Zoom. When Barb was speaking, I was thinking about doing like a seasonal vegetable, like what's growing in your garden type of thing. What are you eating? Zoom meet and greet. We do a coffee hour here in Hillsborough County where I'm at in Florida. And I think, maybe tailoring it to food safety and just what are people growing and what are they eating right now might be a new way to do that. So Lauren says grown-up show and tell. Scott has a comment. I think the biggest violation of food safety I see at our gatherings where food is available is the use of fingers and not utensils to serve. That's a big deal. I am so careful about those utensils. Like in the past, I actually have a huge stash in our office that I know because people don't bring serving utensils. So we went out and bought a bunch of them, and I know people walk off with them too. So just having those extra serving utensils. But Barb, do you have a comment about that?
No, I think that's great, and I'd say we at least in my state, we aren't having events this year where food is shared. But I think if you were, people would have heightened awareness, and also they're more likely to be turned off if they see something like that. So. Right, just all that heightened awareness that food safety, hand hygiene is the way we call it, is so important. Hopefully that's something that we'll take away from this pandemic, is really how important that is. Yeah. Yeah, Janet said toothpicks. I think, right, I'm kind of like Nicole, when there's a potluck at work and if they use, they bring in like it's catered and there's some nice big tongs or something like that. I tend to grab those for my own use in extension programming because the other faculty they don't need those, but in extension we always need lots of, we need to have an extension cord always, and then we also need utensils and plates and whatever else.
Yin has a comment that if the utensils block off, then some other event is safer. Yes. Yeah, don't sweat it.
Okay. So Dara, I'm going to also answer. So Dara has asked a question that I just see in the chat box to me. So on the blog that I run, there is a post from earlier, it's in June or July. There is a caution currently, and this comes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which is located at the University of Georgia. Elderberries, certain varieties of elderberries. It was an article or publication, Acta Hort, where certain varieties of elderberries are high in pH and therefore not safe for canning. So this might be elderberry juice, it might be elderberry jam, jelly. It also might be just elderberries if you were to can those, as you would perhaps other berries. The caution, the question that you could present is, could you add acid to these elderberries like we add acid to tomatoes? Tomatoes are no longer considered acidic enough to can without added acid, either in the form of citric acid or lemon juice. So could you do that with elderberries? The answer is yes, you could. The challenge is nobody's been in the lab to tell us how much consistently to add so that we know that we have enough. So generally, yes, you could process or preserve elderberries as if they were other fruits with added acid. Tomatoes, of course, are fruits, but we don't know how to do that consistently, have a safe product. So Extension recommends not preserving elderberries at this time. So that's just a question that I think Dara had seen. I sometimes wonder if my blog is read, and that day I knew it was. I spent the next hours responding to where did this come from, but it comes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation and their recommendations, which are based on USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. For that, thanks, Dara, for that reminder.
Okay, do we have other questions or comments or even shared resources?
Shauna has something in the chat box about a useful website for produce and food waste. It's www.eatortoss.com. So that sounds interesting. There's a lot of information. I guess I will just say those of us in food safety, and we look at the ugly fruits and vegetables that you can sometimes find increasingly sold. Actually, in grocery stores, there's a local market that is trying to get you to, where I live, so you can get a box of ugly produce every month. This is kind of a fun thing to do. Things that might not be graded as well. That's a great idea to prevent composting. Those of us who also work with our food pantry and emergency food programs are wondering what the impact of those programs will be on produce that we normally see finding its way into food pantries and food banks. So I wholeheartedly support lack of not wasting fruits and vegetables. I'm just waiting to kind of see what the overall balance of that will be.
Yeah, great points. I also appreciated the reminder to make sure that we're wiping down those common touch points, which, you know, include even desks that we work at, telephones, refrigerator handles, any of those things. So it's a good reminder just in the community garden and at the extension office, being very careful about that. And then also your devices, using your phones in the kitchen to make things. Be very careful and make sure that you clean those phones.
Yeah, that's for sure true. Right.
Okay, if there are more comments or questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or unmute yourself. I do see Bill has said wiping down before and after an event is important. Very good. And I do have a colleague, Ava Pabone, here in Florida, and she has created some community and demonstration garden signs that can be posted for COVID-19, similar to the ones that you shared, Barb. So I will send the link out for Wisconsin and the ones that Ava came up with in Florida, and make sure everyone has access to those so they might be able to adapt or create something for their own county extension office.
That's a great idea.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate everyone's attention today, and thank you all for being on the call and sharing your feedback and asking questions. I definitely know every time I prepare food for the next week, I'm going to be extra careful. Thanks to Barb reminding me, you're going to be like in my head. And we will post the recording online. We'll send the link out. Of course, if you have additional questions, you can contact Barb directly and ask her your questions. And everyone stay safe out there, be careful, and continue to support your volunteers and your extension programs. I know everyone is doing a really great job right now, especially with COVID. And all the links that folks are putting into the chat box, we'll send those out as well. Okay, well, thank you, Barb. It was great. Learned a lot today, and thanks everyone for being on the call. We'll see you next time, which will be September 23rd, the fourth Wednesday of the month. Take care. Thanks so much, Barb.